Some voices were taken from the world far too early. Tonight, we're visiting the graves of 20 legendary musicians who died too soon, where they rest, how they got there, and what they left behind. Some of these graves draw thousands. Some sit in silence. All of them belong to people who should have had more time. Let's begin. We begin in Montgomery, Alabama, at Oakwood Cemetery Annex on Upper Wetumpka Road, where one of the most influential figures in American music lies beneath a marker of Alabama granite. Hank Williams was born in Mount Olive, Alabama, in September 1923, into rural poverty, and he learned guitar from a black street musician named Rufus Payne who shaped his entire sound. By his early 20s, he was writing songs of such raw, emotional honesty that they seemed to come from a much older soul. Your cheatin' heart, I'm so lonesome I could cry, cold, cold heart. Hey, good lookin'. He essentially invented the template for modern country songwriting, marrying the blues he learned as a boy to the honky-tonk of the American South. He became the biggest star of the Grand Ole Opry, but chronic back pain, a failed marriage, and a deepening dependence on alcohol and morphine were destroying him even as his fame grew. He was fired from the Opry in 1952 for unreliability. On New Year's Day, 1953, being driven to a concert in Canton, Ohio, Hank Williams died in the back seat of his Cadillac, somewhere in West Virginia, of heart failure brought on by his addictions. He was 29 years old. His driver did not even realize he had died until stopping for gas. His funeral in Montgomery drew more than 20,000 people, the largest gathering the city had ever seen, larger than any event in its history to that point. His grave is a substantial monument, topped with a cowboy hat carved in stone, inscribed with the titles of his songs. His wife Audrey was buried beside him decades later. His grave receives steady visitors, country music pilgrims who understand that nearly every country song written since owes something to the man beneath this stone. He was 29, and he changed American music forever, and he did it in a career that lasted barely 6 years. We travel now to Winchester, Virginia, to Shenandoah Memorial Park on Front Royal Pike, where a woman with one of the greatest voices in the history of American popular music rests beneath a flat bronze marker. Patsy Cline was born Virginia Patterson Hensley in Winchester in September 1932 into hardship, dropping out of school at 15 to help support her family after her father abandoned them. She sang in local clubs and on radio for years, developing a voice of extraordinary power and emotional depth, capable of a controlled sob that could break a listener's heart. Her breakthrough came in 1957 with Walkin' After Midnight, and then, in the early 1960s, a run of recordings that made her immortal. Crazy, written by a young Willie Nelson. I Fall to Pieces, She Got You. She was one of the first female country singers to cross fully into pop stardom, and one of the first to headline her own shows. She was tough, funny, generous, and fiercely protective of other women in the industry, mentoring younger singers like Loretta Lynn. On the 5th of March 1963, returning from a benefit concert in Kansas City, Patsy Cline died when the small plane carrying her crashed in a forest near Camden, Tennessee, in bad weather. She was 30 years old. Also killed were country stars Cowboy Copas and Hawkshaw Hawkins, and the pilot, Randy Hughes, who was her manager. Her body was returned to Winchester for burial. Her grave at Shenandoah Memorial Park is marked by a simple bronze plaque bearing her married name, Virginia H. Dick, along with the words, "Death cannot kill what never dies, love." A memorial bell tower stands nearby. Her grave draws visitors from around the world, drawn by a voice that still sounds, 60 years later, like the most honest expression of heartbreak ever recorded. She was 30, at the absolute peak of her powers, and the plane went down in the trees. We travel now to Frederica, Delaware, to Lakeside Cemetery, where one of the finest singer-songwriters of the 1970s lies far from the spotlight. Jim Croce was born in Philadelphia in January 1943, the son of Italian-American parents who did not want him to be a musician. He spent years struggling, working construction and driving trucks and teaching, playing coffee houses at night, nearly giving up on music entirely more than once. His songs were built on the small details of ordinary lives, told with warmth, humor, and a storyteller's eye. Bad, Bad Leroy Brown. Operator. Time in a bottle. You don't mess around with Jim. I got a name. He had a gift for character, sketching a whole person in a few lines, and a tender streak that produced some of the most beloved love songs of his era. Success came late and fast. After a decade of struggle, he finally broke through in 1972 and 1973 with hit after hit, and he was on the verge of becoming one of the biggest stars in America. He was exhausted from constant touring and homesick for his wife Ingrid and their infant son. On the 20th of September, 1973, after a concert at Northwestern State University in Louisiana, the small chartered plane carrying Jim Croce and 5 others crashed on takeoff, striking a tree at the end of the runway. Everyone aboard was killed. Jim Croce was 30 years old. His song Time in a Bottle, which he had written for his newborn son, was released as a single after his death and went to #1, its lyrics about wanting more time now unbearably poignant. He was buried at Lakeside Cemetery in Frederica, Delaware, near where his family had roots. His grave is a modest flat marker. It receives few visitors, tucked away in a small Delaware town, far from any music tourism route. He was 30. He had struggled for a decade to succeed, and he died just as everything he had worked for finally arrived. We travel now to Renton, Washington, just south of Seattle, to Greenwood Memorial Park, where the greatest electric guitarist who ever lived rests beneath an elaborate granite memorial. Jimi Hendrix was born Johnny Allen Hendrix in Seattle in November 1942, into poverty and a broken home, raised largely by his father after his mother's struggles and early death. He taught himself guitar on a cheap instrument, playing left-handed on a right-handed guitar strung upside down. After a stint in the Army, he worked as a backing musician for R&B acts before being discovered and taken to London, where he exploded into fame almost overnight. In barely 4 years, he redefined what the electric guitar could do. Purple Haze, Hey Joe, The Wind Cries Mary, All Along the Watchtower, Voodoo Child. His performance at Woodstock, including his shattering rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner, became one of the defining images of a generation. He played the instrument with his teeth, behind his back, and with a command of feedback and distortion that no one had imagined possible. On the 18th of September, 1970, in London, Jimi Hendrix died after taking sleeping pills and choking in his sleep. He was 27 years old, the first of the great cluster of musicians who died at that age. His body was returned to Seattle. He was buried at Greenwood Memorial Park in Renton, Washington, in a family plot. For decades, his grave was a simple flat marker, but in 2003, his family built an elaborate granite memorial with a domed pillar and a bronze relief of Hendrix, which now stands over his grave and those of other family members. His grave draws steady pilgrims from around the world, guitarists and fans who leave pics and flowers and cigarettes. He was 27, and in 4 short years he changed music forever, and there has never been anyone else like him before or since in the whole history of the instrument. We travel now to London, to Edgwarebury Jewish Cemetery, where one of the most gifted vocalists of her generation lies beneath a simple stone. Amy Winehouse was born in London in September 1983 into a Jewish family full of jazz lovers, and she grew up absorbing the great female singers of the past, Sarah Vaughan and Dinah Washington and Billie Holiday. She had a voice of astonishing maturity and depth, a rich contralto that sounded like it belonged to a woman who had lived several lifetimes, and she wrote lyrics of brutal, confessional honesty. Her second album, Back to Black, released in 2006, was a masterpiece, blending vintage soul with unflinching songs about heartbreak, addiction, and self-destruction. Rehab, Back to Black, Love is a Losing Game. You Know I'm No Good. She won 5 Grammy Awards in a single night in 2008, but her personal life was collapsing even as her fame peaked. She struggled publicly with addiction to alcohol and drugs, with an eating disorder, and with a turbulent marriage, and the tabloid press documented her deterioration with a cruelty that now seems unforgivable. On the 23rd of July 2011, Amy Winehouse was found dead in her London home. The cause was alcohol poisoning. She was 27 years old, joining the terrible club of musicians who died at that exact age, the same age as Hendrix, Joplin, Morrison, and Cobain. Her body was cremated after a private Jewish funeral, and her ashes were buried at Edgewarebury Jewish Cemetery alongside her grandmother Cynthia, whom she had adored and whose loss had marked the beginning of her decline. Her grave is a simple stone. A foundation established in her name works to help young people struggling with addiction. Her grave receives devoted visitors, fans who understand that she was one of the great vocal talents of her time, gone at 27, having released only 2 albums, both of which will be listened to for as long as people listen to soul music at all. We travel now to Cathedral City, California, in the desert east of Los Angeles, to Desert Memorial Park, where one of the most beloved voices in American popular music rests. Though her final home was not her first, Karen Carpenter was born in New Haven, Connecticut, in March 1950, and moved with her family to California as a teenager. She began as a drummer, an extraordinarily gifted one, but it was her voice that would make her famous, a warm, intimate, effortlessly pure contralto that seemed to speak directly to each listener. With her brother Richard, she formed the Carpenters, and through the 1970s they produced some of the most beloved recordings of the decade, Close to You. We've only just begun, Rainy Days and Mondays, Superstar, Yesterday Once More. Her voice was so natural and unforced that its technical brilliance was easy to miss, but musicians revered her as one of the finest vocalists of her time. Behind the wholesome image, however, Karen Carpenter was suffering. She developed anorexia nervosa in the mid-1970s, at a time when the illness was barely understood by the medical profession or the public. She starved herself for years, her weight dropping dangerously, even as she continued to perform and record. On the 4th of February, 1983, Karen Carpenter died of heart failure caused by the effects of her long struggle with anorexia. She was 32 years old. Her death did more than almost any other single event to bring public awareness to eating disorders, which had been a hidden and shameful affliction. She was originally buried at Forest Lawn in Cypress, California, but in 2003 her remains were moved to Desert Memorial Park in Cathedral City, closer to where her family had settled. Her marker there is an elegant flat bronze plaque bearing the words, "A star on earth, a star in heaven." Her grave draws visitors who still find comfort in that pure, warm voice. She was 32, and the illness that killed her was one that the world was only beginning to understand, in part because of the very public way that she died. We travel now to Los Angeles and to the Pacific Ocean, because one of the greatest voices in the history of soul music was scattered on the water after a death that shocked the world. Marvin Gaye was born in Washington, D.C. in April 1939, the son of a strict and abusive Pentecostal preacher, and the troubled relationship with his father would haunt him his entire life and shape his death. He began at Motown as a session drummer, before becoming one of the label's biggest stars, with a voice of remarkable range and expressiveness that could move from silky seduction to raw spiritual anguish. How sweet it is. Ain't No Mountain High Enough, with Tammi Terrell. I heard it through the grapevine. And then, in 1971, the landmark album, What's Going On, a suite of songs about war, poverty, addiction, and the environment that transformed what soul music could be. Later came the sensual masterpiece, Let's Get It On, and the disco-era comeback, Sexual Healing. But Marvin Gaye struggled with drug addiction, depression, financial ruin, and the deep psychological wounds of his childhood. In his final years, he moved back into his parents' house in Los Angeles, where the old conflict with his father reignited. On the 1st of April 1984, one day before his 45th birthday, during a violent argument, Marvin Gaye was shot and killed by his own father with a gun that Marvin had given him. He was 44 years old. His father was charged with murder but pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and served no prison time, citing a brain tumor and the circumstances of the confrontation. Marvin Gaye was cremated, and his ashes were scattered in the Pacific Ocean by his family. There is a memorial plaque for him at Forest Lawn, Hollywood Hills, though his ashes are in the sea. He was 44, one of the supreme artists of American music, killed by his own father the day before his birthday, a death so tragic and so senseless that it still seems almost impossible to believe. We travel now to Los Angeles, to Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, to the Great Mausoleum, where the most famous entertainer of the modern era rests behind walls that the public cannot enter. Michael Jackson was born in Gary, Indiana, in August 1958, the eighth of 10 children in a poor and famously troubled family, driven relentlessly by his father Joseph. As the lead singer of the Jackson 5, he was a child star of astonishing gifts, and as an adult he became, simply, the biggest pop star the world had ever seen. His 1982 album Thriller remains the best-selling album in history. Billie Jean. Beat It. Thriller. He revolutionized music video, dance, and stage performance, and his moonwalk became one of the most iconic images of the 20th century. But his adult life was consumed by controversy, by allegations, by financial troubles, by an increasingly isolated and troubled existence, and by a dependence on prescription medications administered by doctors willing to give a superstar whatever he asked for. On the 25th of June 2009, while preparing for a comeback concert series in London, Michael Jackson died of acute intoxication from the anesthetic propofol, which his personal physician had been using to help him sleep. He was 50 years old. His physician was later convicted of involuntary manslaughter. Jackson's death triggered a global outpouring of grief on a scale rarely seen, with memorials and tributes across the world and a public funeral watched by an estimated audience in the hundreds of millions. He was entombed at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, in the Holly Terrace section of the Great Mausoleum, in a location that is not accessible to the general public. Fans who make the pilgrimage to Forest Lawn can reach only the exterior of the mausoleum. He was 50, the most famous performer of his time, and he rests behind marble and locked doors, protected from the fans whose devotion had defined and, in some ways, destroyed his life. We travel now to Westfield, New Jersey, to Fairview Cemetery, where one of the greatest voices in the history of recorded music rests after a life and death of almost unbearable tragedy. Whitney Houston was born in Newark, New Jersey, in August 1963, into music royalty, the daughter of gospel singer Cissy Houston, and the cousin of Dionne Warwick, with Aretha Franklin as her godmother. She was blessed with perhaps the most technically perfect voice of her generation, a powerful, agile, crystalline instrument capable of extraordinary feats of control and emotion. Her debut album made her a superstar, and through the late 1980s and 1990s, she was the biggest female singer in the world. Saving All My Love for You, How Will I Know, I Wanna Dance with Somebody. Her recording of I Will Always Love You, from the film The Bodyguard, became one of the best-selling singles of all time. But behind the glamour, Whitney Houston struggled with drug addiction, worsened by a turbulent and troubled marriage, and her voice and her health deteriorated over the years in a decline that played out painfully in public. On the 11th of February 2012, on the eve of the Grammy Awards, Whitney Houston was found dead in a bathtub in her room at the Beverly Hilton Hotel. The cause was accidental drowning, with heart disease and cocaine use as contributing factors. She was 48 years old, in a compounding tragedy almost too cruel to bear. Her only daughter, Bobby Christina Brown, died 3 years later, in nearly identical circumstances, found unresponsive in a bathtub at just 22 years old. Whitney Houston was buried at Fairview Cemetery in Westfield, New Jersey, beside her father, in the state where she was born and raised in the church. Her grave is in a gated area, and access is restricted to protect it from the overwhelming attention it would otherwise draw. She was 48, possessed of one of the greatest voices ever recorded, and she died alone in a hotel bathtub the night before. Music's biggest celebration was to honor her peers. We travel now to Corpus Christi, Texas, to Seaside Memorial Park, where the Queen of Tejano music rests after a death that devastated a community and a nation. Selena Quintanilla Perez was born in Lake Jackson, Texas, in April 1971, into a Mexican-American family, and she began singing as a small child in her family's band, Selena y los Dinos. She sang in Spanish, a language she had to learn phonetically at first, and she became the most important figure in the history of Tejano music, a regional Mexican-American genre that she brought to national and international prominence. Her charisma, her warmth, and her powerful voice made her beloved across the Spanish-speaking world. Como la flor, amor prohibido, beady beady bom bom. She was on the verge of a crossover into English-language pop that would have made her one of the biggest stars in the world, recording an English album that would be released after her death. She was also a successful businesswoman and fashion designer, adored by her fans for her accessibility and her generosity. On the 31st of March, 1995, Selena was shot and killed by Yolanda Saldivar, the president of her fan club and the manager of her boutiques, whom Selena had confronted about embezzlement. Selena managed to run to the lobby of the motel where the shooting occurred and to name her killer before she died. She was 23 years old. Her death caused an outpouring of grief across the Latino community unlike anything before it, with tens of thousands attending memorials and her records selling in enormous numbers. Yolanda Saldivar was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Selena was buried at Seaside Memorial Park in Corpus Christi, the city she had made her home. Her grave is marked by a life-size statue and draws thousands of visitors every year who leave flowers, letters, and tokens of a love that has not faded in 3 decades. She was 23, on the brink of superstardom, killed by a woman she had trusted, and she remains, for millions of people, forever young and forever beloved. We travel now to Hartsdale, New York, to Ferncliff Cemetery, where a young woman of enormous talent and even greater promise rests after an accident of staggering, senseless cruelty. Aaliyah was born Aaliyah Dana Houghton in Brooklyn, New York, in January 1979, and raised in Detroit, and she seemed destined for a long career at the very top of music and film. She had a smooth, sultry, understated voice and an effortless cool that made her one of the defining figures of late 1990s R&B, working with innovative producers who built futuristic soundscapes around her. Back and forth. Are you that somebody? Try again. Rock the boat. She was also breaking into film, starring in Romeo Must Die and completing work on Queen of the Damned, with a role in the Matrix sequels reportedly awaiting her. She was, by every account, gracious, hard-working, and beloved by everyone who worked with her, a young woman of enormous talent and even greater promise. On the 25th of August, 2001, in the Bahamas, after shooting a music video, Aaliyah and 8 others boarded a small plane to return to Florida. The plane was overloaded with passengers and equipment, and the pilot was not properly certified. It crashed shortly after takeoff, killing everyone aboard. Aaliyah was 22 years old. The senselessness of it, an overloaded plane, an unqualified pilot, a preventable catastrophe, made the loss even harder to bear. She was buried at Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, New York, the same cemetery where Judy Garland once rested and where many other figures lie in a private mausoleum. Her grave is not easily accessible to the public. Her family has guarded her memory and her music fiercely in the years since, keeping much of her catalog out of circulation for a long time. She was 22, poised to become one of the biggest stars in the world in both music and film, and she died because a plane was overloaded and a pilot was not qualified to fly it, a death that should never have happened at all. We travel now to Lithonia, Georgia, near Atlanta, to Hillendale Memorial Gardens, where a woman whose sharp voice and fierce spirit made her one of the most distinctive figures in 1990s music rests beneath a modest marker. Lisa Lopes, known as Left Eye, was born in Philadelphia in May 1971 into a difficult home with an abusive, alcoholic father, and she carried both toughness and vulnerability into everything she did. As a member of TLC, one of the best-selling girl groups of all time, she was the rapper, the wild energy, the one who wrote the sharp verses and brought the unpredictable spark. Waterfalls, Creep, No Scrubs, Unpretty. The group sold tens of millions of records and spoke to a generation of young women about self-worth, safe sex, and independence. Left Eye was the most controversial and creative member, a restless artist who chafed against the constraints of the group and pursued solo projects and spiritual searching. Her life was turbulent and sometimes destructive, including an infamous incident in which she burned down the mansion of her boyfriend. But those who knew her spoke of a deeply thoughtful, searching person beneath the wild reputation. On the 25th of April, 2002, while on a spiritual retreat in Honduras, Lisa Lopes was driving a rented SUV when she swerved to avoid another vehicle, lost control, and crashed. She was killed instantly. She was 30 years old. Remarkably, she had been filming much of her trip, and the camera captured moments before the accident, giving her death an eerie documentary quality. She was buried at Hillendale Memorial Gardens in Lithonia, Georgia, near Atlanta, where TLC had built their careers. Her grave is a modest marker. Her surviving TLC bandmates have honored her memory in their music and performances in the 2 decades since. She was 30, one of the most creative and unpredictable talents of her era, a woman searching for meaning and peace, and she died on a spiritual retreat, thousands of miles from home, on a lonely road in Honduras. We travel now to Los Angeles, and then into memory, because the man we visit now was cremated, his ashes distributed among those who loved him and never laid in a public grave. Tupac Shakur was born Lesane Parish Crooks in East Harlem, New York, in June 1971, the son of a Black Panther activist, and he was named after an Incan revolutionary. He was one of the most gifted and complex figures in the history of hip-hop, a poet of genuine literary talent, an actor of real ability, and a voice for the anger, pain, and hope of a generation. His music ranged from tender social consciousness to raw aggression. Dear Mama, Keep Ya Head Up, California Love, Changes. He sold tens of millions of records and became a genuine cultural icon, embodying contradictions that he never tried to resolve, thug and philosopher, revolutionary and provocateur. But he lived a turbulent and dangerous life, marked by legal troubles, imprisonment, and a violent feud between the East Coast and West Coast hip-hop worlds that would consume him. On the 7th of September, 1996, in Las Vegas, Tupac Shakur was shot multiple times in a drive-by shooting while riding in a car with the music executive Suge Knight. He died 6 days later, on the 13th of September, 1996, of his injuries. He was 25 years old. His murder went unsolved for decades, the subject of endless investigation and speculation, until an arrest was finally made many years later. Tupac was cremated, and there is no public grave. His mother, Afeni Shakur, kept his ashes, and some were reportedly mixed and shared among members of his group and inner circle. He remains, more than 25 years after his death, one of the best-selling and most influential artists in the world, with more music released after his death than during his life. He was 25, a poet and a revolutionary and a superstar gunned down on the Las Vegas Strip, and his voice still speaks to millions of people who were not even born when he died. We travel now to Brooklyn, New York, and beyond, because the man we visit now was cremated, his ashes carried through the streets of the neighborhood that made him. Christopher Wallace, known as the Notorious B.I.G. and as Biggie Smalls, was born in Brooklyn in May 1972, the only child of a Jamaican immigrant mother, and he grew up in the Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood, where he began selling drugs as a teenager before finding his way to music. He was one of the greatest lyricists in the history of hip-hop, a storyteller of extraordinary skill with a deep, commanding voice and an effortless flow that made the most complex rhymes sound conversational. Juicy, Big Papa, Hypnotize. Mo Money, Mo Problems. His debut album, Ready to Die, is considered one of the greatest hip-hop records ever made. He was the biggest star of the East Coast hip-hop scene, and he was caught, like Tupac Shakur, in the deadly feud between the coasts that defined and darkened the era. The two men had once been friends before the rivalry poisoned everything between them. On the 9th of March, 1997, just 6 months after Tupac's murder, the Notorious B.I.G. was shot and killed in a drive-by shooting in Los Angeles while sitting in his vehicle after a party. He was 24 years old. His murder, like Tupac's, has never been officially solved to this day. His album Life After Death was released just weeks after his death and became one of the best-selling hip-hop albums of all time, its title now unbearably prophetic. He was cremated, and his ashes were given to his family. His funeral procession traveled through the streets of Brooklyn, where thousands of fans gathered to mourn him in the very neighborhood he had immortalized in his music. He was 24, one of the greatest rappers who ever lived, murdered 6 months after his friend and rival, two young geniuses cut down within half a year of each other, their killings still unsolved. We travel now across the ocean to 9 Mile, Jamaica, in the hills of the parish of St. Anne, where the man who brought reggae to the world rests in a mausoleum near the house where he was born. Bob Marley was born in 9 Mile in February 1945, the son of a black Jamaican mother and a white English father who was largely absent. He grew up in poverty, both in the countryside and in the trench-town slum of Kingston, and out of that hardship he created music of extraordinary spiritual power and universal appeal. With his group, the Wailers, he transformed reggae from a local Jamaican style into a global phenomenon and became the voice of a musical and spiritual movement rooted in Rastafari. No Woman, No Cry, Redemption Song, One Love, Get Up, Stand Up, Could You Be Loved? His songs spoke of oppression and liberation, of faith and love and resistance, and they made him a hero across the developing world and a beloved figure everywhere. In 1977, a malignant melanoma was discovered under a toenail, but Marley, for reasons connected to his Rastafari beliefs, declined to have the toe amputated. The cancer spread through his body over the following years. He collapsed while jogging in New York in 1980 and learned the cancer had reached his brain, lungs, and liver. On the 11th of May, 1981, Bob Marley died in Miami, en route home to Jamaica. He was 36 years old. His body was returned to Jamaica, where he was given a state funeral, an extraordinary honor reflecting his stature as a national hero. He was entombed in a mausoleum in 9 Mile, near the house where he was born, along with his guitar and other cherished possessions. His grave has become a place of pilgrimage for fans from every corner of the earth who travel to the remote Jamaican hills to pay their respects. He was 36, and he had given the world a music and a message that continue to spread, and his grave in the hills of St. Anne is one of the most visited musical shrines on the entire planet. We travel now to Cypress, California, to Forest Lawn Memorial Park, where one of the true founding architects of rock and roll rests beneath a modest marker, far from the country where he was more beloved than at home. Eddie Cochran was born in Albert Lea, Minnesota, in October 1938, and raised in California, and in his brief life he became one of the founders of rock and roll. He was a brilliant guitarist and a natural songwriter, and his recordings captured the restless energy and rebellion of American teenage life with a wit and swagger that influenced generations of musicians who followed. Summertime Blues, Come On Everybody, Something Else. His songs about teenage frustration, about not having money or a car or freedom, spoke directly to young people and became anthems, and his innovative guitar work made him a hero to the British musicians who would soon lead the rock revolution. In 1960, Eddie Cochran was touring Britain, where he was even more popular than in America, alongside his friend Gene Vincent. On the 17th of April, 1960, a taxi carrying Cochran, Vincent, and Cochran's songwriter fiancée Sharon Sheeley crashed at high speed near Chippenham in Wiltshire, England. Eddie Cochran, thrown from the vehicle, suffered severe head injuries, and died the following day. He was 21 years old. Gene Vincent and Sharon Sheeley survived, though both were injured, and Vincent would carry the effects of the crash for the rest of his own shortened life. In an eerie coincidence, Cochran's final hit, released after his death, was a cover of the song 3 Steps to Heaven. His body was returned to America, and he was buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Cypress, California. His grave is a modest marker. He receives fewer visitors than his enormous influence would suggest, remembered mostly by rockabilly devotees and students of early rock and roll. He was 21, one of the true founders of the music, and he died on an English road, having left behind only 2 years of recordings that changed the sound of the world forever. We travel now to Los Angeles, to Westwood Village Memorial Park, the small, star-filled cemetery where a woman whose voice reached notes that seemed to belong to another world lies near many other legends. Minnie Riperton was born in Chicago in November 1947, the youngest of 8 children, and she trained in opera as a girl, developing a coloratura soprano of extraordinary range, capable of a whistle register that few singers in history have ever commanded. She began her career singing backup and working at Chess Records, before joining the group Rotary Connection and then launching a solo career. Her masterpiece was the 1975 single, Lovin' You, a tender, ethereal love song written for her daughter, its soaring high notes floating over the melody like birdsong, becoming a worldwide #1 hit. Her voice was a genuine marvel, able to move from a warm, intimate, low register to those impossibly high, pure notes that seemed almost supernatural. In 1976, at the peak of her career, Minnie Riperton was diagnosed with breast cancer, which had already spread and was terminal. Rather than hide her illness, she became one of the first celebrities to speak publicly about breast cancer, serving as a spokesperson and educator and raising awareness at a time when the disease was still spoken of only in whispers. She continued to record and perform even as the cancer advanced, undergoing a mastectomy and continuing to work with remarkable courage. On the 12th of July, 1979, Minnie Riperton died of cancer in Los Angeles. She was 31 years old. Her daughter, for whom she had written Lovin' You, grew up to be the comedian and actress Maya Rudolph. Minnie Riperton was buried at Westwood Village Memorial Park in Los Angeles, the small star-filled cemetery where Marilyn Monroe also rests. Her marker bears the word Lovin' You, the title of the song she wrote for her child. Her grave is quiet, passed by most of the visitors who come for more famous names. She was 31, gifted with one of the most remarkable voices in recorded music, and she faced her death with a courage and an openness that helped countless others who came after her. We travel now to Sharon Hill, Pennsylvania, near Philadelphia, to Mount Lawn Cemetery, where a woman whose voice helped define the Motown sound rests after one of the most poignant deaths in the history of soul music. Tammi Terrell was born Thomasina Montgomery in Philadelphia in April 1945, and she was a prodigiously talented singer who began performing as a teenager and signed with Motown in her early 20s. She is best remembered for her extraordinary series of duets with Marvin Gaye, recordings so full of warmth and chemistry that listeners assumed the two were in love, though their bond was one of deep friendship. Ain't no mountain high enough, your precious love. Ain't nothing like the real thing. You're all I need to get by. Their voices together created some of the most joyful and beloved recordings in the entire Motown catalog. But Tammi Terrell's life was marked by suffering, including abusive relationships, and then by a catastrophic illness. On the 14th of October, 1967, while performing on stage with Marvin Gaye, she collapsed into his arms. She was diagnosed with a malignant brain tumor. Over the next 3 years, Tammi Terrell endured 8 brain surgeries, gradually losing her ability to walk, to see, and finally to function, even as Motown released recordings she had made before her illness. Marvin Gaye was devastated by her decline, and her suffering contributed to his own withdrawal from performing and to the darkness that shadowed the rest of his life. On the 16th of March, 1970, Tammi Terrell died of her brain tumor. She was 24 years old. Her funeral in Philadelphia was attended by the Motown family and by thousands of grieving fans. She was buried at Mount Lawn Cemetery in Sharon Hill, Pennsylvania, near Philadelphia. Her grave is a modest marker, and it receives few visitors, though her voice lives on in some of the most beloved duets ever recorded in American music. She was 24, one of the great voices of Motown, and she spent the last 3 years of her young life fighting a brain tumor through surgery after surgery, collapsing in the arms of the man whose voice was forever joined to hers. We travel now to New York City, to Strawberry Fields in Central Park, and to the memory of a man whose ashes have no public grave, but whose death changed the world. John Lennon was born in Liverpool, England, in October 1940, during a German air raid, and raised largely by an aunt after his parents' separation. He was, with Paul McCartney, the creative heart of the Beatles, the most influential band in the history of popular music, and one of the most gifted songwriters who ever lived. From the early joy of the Beatles' first hits through the psychedelic experimentation and profound artistry of their later work, Lennon helped reshape what popular music could be and what it could say. A Hard Day's Night, Strawberry Fields Forever, Come Together, and in his solo career, songs of raw honesty and utopian hope. Imagine, Instant Karma, Jealous Guy. After the Beatles broke up, he became an activist for peace, a controversial and outspoken figure, and eventually, in his final years, a devoted father who had stepped back from music to raise his son before returning with a new album. On the 8th of December, 1980, outside his apartment building, the Dakota, on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, John Lennon was shot 4 times by a deranged man who had obtained his autograph only hours earlier. He was pronounced dead at a nearby hospital. He was 40 years old. The news triggered a wave of grief around the world, with vigils held in cities across the globe and hundreds of thousands gathering in mourning. His widow, Yoko Ono, requested that people observe 10 minutes of silence rather than public gatherings. John Lennon was cremated, and there is no public grave. His ashes remained with Yoko Ono. Across the street from the Dakota, in Central Park, a memorial called Strawberry Fields was created, centered on a mosaic bearing the single word, Imagine. Fans gather there every year on the anniversary of his death and his birth. He was 40, one of the greatest songwriters of the 20th century, murdered by a stranger outside his own home, and the world has never truly stopped mourning him in all the years since. We travel now, for our final grave, to the Mississippi Delta, near Greenwood, Mississippi, where the most mythologized figure in the history of the blues lies in a grave that no one can definitively find. Robert Johnson was born in Hazelhurst, Mississippi, in May 1911, and so little is certain about his life that legend has filled every gap. He was a traveling Delta blues musician who recorded only 29 songs in his brief life, in 2 recording sessions in 1936 and 1937. But those recordings became the foundation of modern blues and, through it, of rock and roll. Crossroad Blues, Hellhound on My Trail, Sweet Home Chicago, Love in Vain. His guitar playing and his haunted, keening voice influenced virtually every blues and rock musician who came after him, from Eric Clapton to the Rolling Stones. The most famous legend about him holds that he sold his soul to the devil at a crossroads in exchange for his supernatural musical ability, a myth that grew from the sudden leap in his skill and from the dark imagery of his songs. On the 16th of August, 1938, Robert Johnson died near Greenwood, Mississippi, at just 27 years old, making him perhaps the earliest member of the tragic club of musicians who died at that age. The circumstances of his death are uncertain, but the most widely accepted account is that he was poisoned with strychnine-laced whiskey by the jealous husband of a woman he had been involved with. He died in agony over several days. He was buried in an unmarked grave, and the exact location was lost for decades. Today, there are 3 separate sites near Greenwood that claim to be his burial place, each marked with a memorial stone placed by admirers, because no one knows for certain which is the true grave. He was 27. He recorded only 29 songs in his entire life, and he became the ghost at the very origin of all rock and roll, buried somewhere in the Mississippi Delta in a grave that no living person can definitively find. 20 musicians, 20 graves, or in some cases, no grave at all. Some are grand monuments visited by thousands. Some are simple stones in quiet cemeteries. Some are ashes scattered in the sea or held by grieving families. And some are lost entirely, like Robert Johnson's, marked by 3 competing stones because no one knows the truth. What connects them is the cruelty of the arithmetic. Hank Williams at 29, Patsy Cline at 30, Jim Croce at 30, Hendrix at 27, Amy Winehouse at 27, Karen Carpenter at 32, Marvin Gaye at 44, Michael Jackson at 50, Whitney Houston at 48, Selena at 23, Aaliyah at 22, Left Eye at 30, Tupac at 25, Biggie at 24, Bob Marley at 36, Eddie Cochran at 21, Minnie Riperton at 31, Tammi Terrell at 24, John Lennon at 40, Robert Johnson at 27. Not one of them reached what should have been the middle of their lives. They were taken by plane crashes and car crashes, by addiction and by cancer, by violence and by murder, by illness and by accident. Some deaths were preventable, some were nobody's fault. All of them left the world with less music than it should have had. What we can do, tonight and every night, is remember them. Play their records, say their names. Think of the specific ground where each of them lies, or the sea that holds them, or the crossroads where one of them is said to have made his bargain. It costs us nothing, and it is one of the few things we can offer the people who gave us so much and left us so soon. They gave us their voices, their songs, their whole brief, brilliant lives. The least we can do is not forget them. Thank you for walking with me. Rest well. And if you pass a cemetery in the coming week, and you have a moment, stop and read a name. Any name. Someone was loved, once, who is buried there. It costs us nothing. And it may be the only thing that keeps any of us from disappearing entirely. Good night, friends.